everyone, to our Scholars in the Square lecture for this evening. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. Now, as a reminder, our format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, Sarah Madsen, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then she will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Dr. Gary Kuchar, professor of English at UVic and a former faculty fellow at the CSRS, where we affectionately refer to him as the smartest person on campus. A specialist of early modern English religious literature, he is the author of 4 monographs, including Shakespeare and the World of Sins and Arrows, Poetic Faith in a Postmodern Age, which received an honorable mention for the Anne Salmeyer Award for the Canadian Association for Theatre Research. After Sarah and Gary talk for 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period. So our speaker for this evening is Sarah Madsen. Sarah is a master's student in history and this year's Winifred Lonsdale Graduate Student Fellow at the CSRS. Sarah's project, on which she will speak tonight, explores conspiracy culture and populism in 17th century England. Her research focuses more broadly on Restoration England, conspiratorial politics, moral panics, criminal justice, and religious divisions, all the fun stuff. I've really appreciated learning alongside Sarah this year and have been impressed with her ability, like the best historians I know, to show how many of the contemporary issues we are facing in the world today have historical precedents, while also showing how historical events such as the Popish Plot can tell us something about our current political moment. In this way, Sarah's work shows us how historical events impact and reverberate in the world today. And while on these lands, it's important for us to always remember the ways that the past shapes and informs our current realities. And so with that, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, the Songhees, and Wasepsum Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you to the Center for having me and for everyone for coming tonight. So tonight I'm going to discuss late 17th century England. And in particular, I aim to demonstrate the ways in which conspiratorial thought permeated late 17th century English society and how it often responded to real and legitimate concerns over religion and politics. I will map the ways in which prejudicial belief about Catholicism and Protestant fundamentalism both preceded the Popish Plot crisis, was a crucial impetus in its development, and ultimately transformed as concerns over arbitrary rule, tyranny, and populism shifted throughout the crisis. In particular, I will analyze how these changing interpretations were understood by the judicial bench. And a point to start off with, the term Protestant fundamentalist encompasses non-Anglican Protestants of varying denominations. In this lecture, I will use the term Puritan to speak to this group, although it is pretty anachronistic for this period. Puritans were also called dissenters and nonconformists during this period, but for the sake of convenience and also because it was utilized by critics in the 1670s and 80s, along with the term Presbyterian, it was used to associate this pretty vast religious category with the values of the Puritans of the mid-17th century and of the English Civil Wars. So starting off with some context. Since the Reformation, England had experienced ongoing religious and political insecurity. The 1570 Regnans in Excelsis papal bull had excommunicated Elizabeth I, placing the English monarchy in an insecure position in relation to European Catholic powers. The 1641 Irish Rebellion and the 1642 to 51 English Civil Wars resulted in lasting traumas and anxieties about the consequences of a divided nation. Guilt over the regicide of Charles I with treason lingered, resulting in the perceived need to shift blame onto individuals and minority groups. This period of emergency across the British Isles did not exist in a vacuum. English people were aware and afraid of violence and conspiracy on the continent, which had its origins in religious division. Recent memory was the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the 1618 to 48 30 Years' War, and the assassination of heads of state, including the killing of William of Orange in 1584. This environment of insecurity fostered the ideal conditions for a culture of conspiracy to flourish. Conspiracy culture in this context can be defined as collective attitudes, which make people attuned to believing in secret knowledge pathways. The possibility of Catholic conspiracies against the English nation appeared real and legitimate, due largely to the precedent of actual conspiracies and living memory, both across the Isles, most notably the 1605 Gunpowder Plot, which there's a painting of there on the left, and on the continent, solidifying many prejudicial anti-Catholic beliefs. And then, so for some context on the Popish Plot crisis, the 1678 to 81 Popish Plot was a fictitious conspiracy to kill Charles II, overthrow Parliament and the Anglican Church, and reestablish Catholicism in England. Anxieties over the crisis allowed for typically unreliable witnesses and informers from obscure social backgrounds, such as servants accusing superiors, to appear credible and threatening to invert conventional political power structures. The crisis led to the execution of over a dozen innocent English Catholics for treason. It resulted in the exclusion crisis, which was an attempt by many members of Parliament and many lords to exclude Charles's brother James, Duke of York, from the succession because he was Catholic. And amidst this political tension, two factions emerged. The first were the exclusionists, who supported the Duke of York's exclusion, and after 1680 were known as the Whigs. And the royalists, who were against the Duke's exclusion, were known as the Tories after 1680. For the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to stick to the exclusionists and royalists in order to not be anachronistic once again. But yeah, this kind of is seen as the beginning of the division of party politics and the formation of political parties. So by the late 17th century, Roman Catholic Church was believed by many English Protestants to be corrupt, heretical, and idolatrous. Anti-Catholicism was enshrined in a number of penal laws seen here, which effectively barred Catholics from living in England, Catholic priests from living in England and converting English Protestants, and which prohibited Catholics from holding public offices. So basically, they were barred from public life. Catholics were occasionally also held responsible for recent traumatic events, including the English Civil Wars and the 1666 Great Fire of London. The latter was dogged by anti-Catholic conspiracy theories, including rumors that Jesuits had thrown firebombs and cut off water supplies in order to fuel a fire. And as historian Tim Harris has detailed, anti-Catholicism was separate from anti-popery, which was a pejorative term given to Roman Catholicism, which emphasized papists' association with the Pope and the papal system. The Pope, who was sometimes cast as the Antichrist, was associated with arbitrary rule and corrupt papal dispensations. Anti-popery acted as an ideology and a fundamental component of English national identity, which defined itself in opposition to a larger international papal threat. Anti-papist rhetoric was utilized to defend the crown and the Church of England by royalists, and as well as to criticize both of these institutions by exclusionists. The period was also permeated by accusations of crypto-Catholicism, belief that individuals were secretly Catholic, covertly trying to further the papist agenda, which were used to attack political rivals. And you can kind of see here, there's this production of playing cards during the period of the crisis. So here on the left, it's the devil supplying the Pope with plotters in order to heal the papal agenda. And so the idea was that this was covert and happening all around, and people just weren't aware of it. And some of the fears of discrete things happening behind the scenes were valid because there were instances of secret negotiations across states. But these were really very prejudicial beliefs that kind of permeated society. And because I'm discussing mostly judges tonight, it could be easy to see conservative members of the judicial bench as supportive of Catholics, largely because they were in opposition to the policies of the exclusionists. But like most English Protestants in this period, the judges were also vehemently anti-Catholic and were intolerant to Catholic defendants and witnesses throughout the Popish Plot trials. And although anti-Catholicism permeated English Protestant society, it was not a uniting force by any means. So exclusionists saw Catholicism as a danger to Protestant nations, promoting tyrannical rule and blind loyalty to the Pope. Royalists associated Catholicism with Puritanism and understood them both as having anti-monarchical interests reminiscent of the English Civil Wars. Both Catholics and Puritans were thus represented as being disloyal to the English nation. And this is a crucial component of this because this disloyalty is used as an attack. And the prejudicial use of anti-Catholic and anti-Puritan narratives for political advantage occasionally included false flag conspiracies, such as the belief that Jesuits would and had previously disguised themselves as Puritans to sow dissent, including during the Civil Wars. And these conspiracies are perhaps akin to modern false flag beliefs, which we've seen with the conspiracy theory that January 6th attackers were really Antifa disguised as far-right conservatives in order to discredit their political aims and narratives. And this reflects a desire from those inside partisan groups to separate themselves from the actions of their supposed kin when it appeared to disrupt political conventions understood as necessary to the security of the state. And now I'm going to get into populism, which is a complicated term to define within the context of late 17th century England, mostly because the term was utilized to criticize a number of perceived political threats. So in some contexts, it can be defined as political participation by the public, or made up of non-landed elites and excluded lower middling sorts. This included people like merchants and bankers who had traditionally been excluded from the sphere of political debate, which had been historically dominated by a small group of elite men who were increasingly subject to charges and accusations of corruption and conspiracy. The growth of the public sphere and its increased authority over the course of the century resulted in politicians on either side of the political spectrum attempting to court popular opinion in the City of London. Popular politics were most commonly expressed through petitions, rioting, pamphleteering, and Pope-burning processions. And then in other contexts, populism can be defined as the increased political power of independent civic offices, especially in London. So concern over this mostly and especially manifested around mayoral and shrieval offices, which are both elected civil bodies, and in particular the threat of the political independence of sheriffs posed a significant threat throughout the crisis because they were responsible for impaneling juries. The sheriffs who held office during the crisis were mostly sympathetic to the exclusionist cause and thus frequently impaneled juries who were politically opposed to the values of the conservative judges. And especially within the City of London, fear of populism was often linked by conservative to anti-Puritan rhetoric. And due to the perceived ties between Protestant fundamentalists and Puritanism, anxieties over memories of the Civil Wars often associated Protestant fundamentalists with republicanism and thus regicide because that had been the consequence of the Civil Wars. Concern over populism in London was reinforced by the presence of a significant population of Puritans or Protestant fundamentalists living in the city. Now to get to judges. The Popish Plot crisis was dominated by a series of trials prosecuting those accused of participating in this conspiracy. The judges who presided over the trials, who I put up kind of the most crucial ones of these to my thesis, the judges were mostly conservative and were appointed by the king, and they weren't always from elite backgrounds. and their lower social status was occasionally deployed to provide further credibility to critiques made against them. And initially, the judges led by Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir William Scroggs, who is at the top of the screen there. Initially, the judges went along with the prosecution of the plot and only acquitted one person prior to mid-1679. So this is just an overwhelming finding of people guilty for participating in this supposed conspiracy. So there's a moment of change, however, though, with the acquittal of the Queen's Catholic physician, George Wakeman, in July 1679. And this Wakeman's acquittal marks the shift in attitudes about the plot. As well as growing concern by conservative judges over the dangers of an increasingly politically involved public. And as well, exclusionist intolerance for what they regarded as the untenable political powers of the court. Scroggs was subject to a slew of criticism in the aftermath of Wakeman's trial and was held as personally responsible for failing to achieve Wakeman's conviction. Scroggs was also dogged by rumors that he had engaged in bribery, a rumor that appeared credible because the Chief Justice had been personally thanked by the Portuguese ambassador, who was an associate of the Queen following Wakeman's trial. So something he had no control over, but it wasn't great for his public image. And Parliament had the power to impeach judges, and consequently, the plot judges were afraid of being impeached in the House of Commons. Thus, the accusations of members of the judicial bench occasionally appear erratic throughout the crisis, and this can likely be explained by the fact that they were scared of the consequences to their political careers. Their careers. So in fact, the actions of the judicial bench eventually were debated in the House of Commons, where exclusionists pushed for the impeachment of Scroggs, as well as these two other judges, Francis North and George Jeffreys, on treason charges. And so the fact that they're accused of treason itself is important because it suggested that the actions of the judges went against the interests of both the nation and the people. And thus, in a similar fashion to how Charles I had been executed for treason as a king, the definition of this criminal charge was shifting to conceptualize treason as being against the state rather than against the monarch. But however, it remained necessary to characterize treason prosecutions as being in defense of the king in a manner which aligned with the traditional trope of attacking the king's advisors rather than the king directly. During the proceedings against Scroggs, exclusionists cited historical examples of judges being prosecuted when they endangered the security of the state and the law of the nation. So this demonstrates the need to place their actions against the judicial bench within a legal precedent, and asserting that they had the authority to do so. During the attack on the judicial bench, the judges were accused of acting arbitrarily. This accusation was reminiscent of the exclusionist concern over the tyranny of the crown. Anti-Catholic narratives were also utilized to attack judges who were accused of furthering the papist agenda by subverting the true law. This attack on the judicial bench reflected increasing anxieties over the power of the courts and its judges. So when Parliament was not in session, as was frequently the case throughout the period of this crisis, the king frequently prorogues Parliament during this period. The court acted as an alternative political forum. An influx of petitioning requesting the king to call Parliament during these periods reflects a sense of urgency in needing the form of political debate to return to the Commons and away from the courts in order to address the political concerns of the public. As well, the exclusionists' critique of the arbitrary power of judges reflected concerns over the ongoing tensions between judges and juries, as each attempted to secure their own authority. So not long before this case and this crisis, in 1670, Bushell's case had established the independence of juries and it had determined that juries could not be punished for delivering decisions contrary to the judge's instructions. In practice, judges continued to assert control over the authorities, so this was constantly in contention, and thus the attack on the judicial bench was also an attempt by exclusionist politicians to regulate judges when they challenged the jury's independence. Consequently, judges eventually began to view populism and the exclusionists as a threat to both the monarchy as well as the entire hierarchical legal chain of command. Judges were critical of juries being given too much authority when they did not have formal legal training. The judgment of the tag and rag, which is articulated in this this letter here to one of the judges who House of Commons attempts to impeach during this period, where here it says the judgment of the tag and rag are made equal to those of the greatest men, and this is seen as like a very worrying concern. So the judgment of the tag and rag asserted through petitions and processions additionally appeared dangerous because it invoked the growing political participation which had preceded the civil wars, where there had been an influx of petitioning. The use of petitioning to call for the return of Parliament also posed a threat to the judges because they risked being impeached while Parliament was in session. And amidst the growing criticism of the judicial bench, judges, including Scroggs, attempted to crack down on pamphleteers who they believed had defamed them. The form of libel that these pamphleteers were accused of, it's called scandal magnatum, was understood to be a greater offense than standard libel because it attacked a social superior, such as a judge, peer, or higher officer. So these sorts of crimes were seen as even worse when they attacked a social superior. Judges characterized libelous pamphlets as dangerous because they had the possibility of being misused by Catholics, because they threatened to incite another civil war. And during the proceedings against Scroggs, the prosecution of pamphleteers was cited by exclusionists as another example of the dangerous arbitrary power of judges who appeared to be able to silence critical commentary without oversight, thus endangering those who spoke freely. So not only did the case of pamphleteering once again reflect the lingering traumas of the mid-17th century, but it provided another example of how individuals utilize fear and prejudicial rhetoric to further their own personal and political agendas.
Now we'll have 20 minutes or so of conversation between Gary and Sarah.
Thanks so much for that. This is an absolutely fascinating moment in history, and you did a beautiful job of sketching out one particular angle on it in a really rich way. And there's obviously all kinds of contemporary parallels that I'm sure we can get to. Maybe the first question I'll ask is, I imagine, given the significance of the Popish Plot within the broader sweep of British history, for example, you mentioned that this is viewed as the period when party politics actually begin to emerge, and we can maybe get to that later, but can you just give us a sense of what the debate amongst historians is about this period? Like, I imagine there are different ways of interpreting the significance of this event. What do historians debate in terms of the broader picture of the Popish Plot?
Yeah, I would say that there have certainly been iterations of interpretation of the plot. So a really interesting characteristic of the historiography of the plot has been that there's a number of histories that were published as the plot was still unfolding and in the years not long after the plot. And these are quite influential to later characterizations of the plot. And these histories were very, very partisan and reflected distinctly Whig, Tory, and Catholic perspectives. And then into the 19th and mid-20th century, histories typically represented the crisis as a moment of hysteria, which was weaponized by politicians in order to further their agenda. So really it's seen as these politicians are puppet masters of this plot. Recent scholarship has really tended to provide more agency to the people involved in the plot. So while this scholarship of the 19th and mid-20th century has really provided some extensive, fantastic foundational research, it's a little bit reductive in terms of the agency and the complexity of the motivations of people at the time. So yeah, I tend to be sympathetic with the work of people like Jonathan Scott and Jeffrey Collins, who emphasize that the fears that people were expressed during the crisis were real and legitimate and had historical precedent.
So that's a real big shift from historians saying this story is about the paranoid persecution of a minority to historians saying actually there is real cause for paranoia here, or at least cause for concern, and that populist agenda needs to be taken more seriously, not just seen as a symptomatic reaction. And I thought you did a good job of laying out the quote, like let's call it legitimacy of those concerns within the broader sweep of English history, going back to the Gunpowder Plot, which is a plot to blow up Parliament and kill the king and kill the ruling classes, and the plots against Queen Elizabeth's life. Were there things specific to Charles II's policies that accentuated that concern above and beyond the fact that the heir to be looked to be a Catholic, because Charles doesn't have any children, right?
Yeah.
So we've got a Catholic in waiting. So that's a concern. But what about Charles's policies? Right? Or did he do anything that may have actually contributed to this populist concern?
Oh, definitely. Concern wasn't just about his brother. It was really a lot to do with Charles himself. So for context, the British monarchy was restored in 1660, so just 18 years before this crisis begins. And people really hoped that this restoration was going to bring some security back to the state. And Charles, while he was a very likable and charismatic person, a lot of his policies were totally aligned with what Parliament would have liked to do. For example, I mentioned briefly that he kept proroguing Parliament. It wasn't required that Parliament had to be in existence during this period. The king could call it and prorogue it at essentially his own prerogative. And then he was also participating in what people likely suspected was the case to be shady international and foreign policy. For example, he in 1670 signs the Treaty of Dover, which he did so in secret, but it basically, in doing so, he made a promise in exchange for money from the French King Louis XIV to convert England to Catholicism, and he personally promised to convert to Catholicism himself. So it wasn't just that his brother was feared to be a Catholic, it was that he himself was suspected to be a Catholic and secretly trying to further this papist agenda. And then on top of that, he's also constantly trying to build a standing army, which was a worrying issue when a civil war had just happened. Having a standing army doesn't inspire hope and settlement at the best of times. So the policies he was engaging with, and he also kept things very close to his chest. He really didn't share. I think probably a lot of that stemmed from the fact that he, as a young man, had experienced his father's death at the hands of, as a result of the Civil War, and had experienced his father's execution, and then had personally experienced that insecurity and had knowledge that he could be deposed in a similar fashion. So he kept things really close to himself, which didn't inspire much confidence amongst other people.
So to my mind, it's absolutely astonishing what he did at the Treaty of Dover. Like to promise to convert the country back to Catholicism.
Just himself.
Was it just himself?
Yeah,
I've
just
heard it
himself.
both ways.
Well,
But okay, that makes more sense.
Toleration.
That makes more sense. But was he being sincere, or is he playing Louis?
Well, it's potentially up for debate. It's reported supposedly that he had converted on his deathbed to Catholicism. But who knows if it was also an attempt that whether he had personally planned to confess earlier or not. He kind of delayed it because it was politically
I mean, we can't really answer that question, but I guess the point here is that this paranoia that you were analyzing is coming out of some real concerns. And so you've got a really difficult problem here, historically and politically, which is what do you do with a fictional plot that's addressing a real issue that perhaps the monarchy is not handling very well? How do you deal with that? And so I guess maybe the one question I'm interested in is you mentioned that after Parliament is prorogued, the judiciary serves as an alternative political forum. How legitimate and effective was that as a political forum rather than as a spectacle or kind of grandstanding, right? I'm just thinking, when you think about some of the congressional hearings today or parliamentary hearings, oftentimes it's not really about working through a policy in good faith, it's about putting on a performance. How does this alternative political forum look in terms of an actual political process?
Yeah, it was certainly a forum for political debate and a play of politics. The judicial system had been an arena to assert personal and political perspectives from judges to juries, defendants, witnesses. And as I briefly discussed earlier, the arena was also a power struggles between judges and juries. And during this struggle, exclusionist sheriffs attempted to push their own political agendas away by stacking juries with like-minded folk in order to sway judicial decisions in their favor and away from the policies that were expected to be held by political opinions expected to be held by conservative judges. The king also utilized the courts in his own to achieve his own political agenda because he had control over the appointments of judges. There's a moment in the crisis where the Lord Chief Justice Groggs, because he's facing an attempted impeachment, he's no longer really advantageous to have as the head of the court. The king basically takes him down from the position and replaces him with a judge that he thinks will achieve the conviction of an individual who is politically advantageous for him to have a conviction of. This move also reveals another key component of the court's political power, which was that the Parliament and King's Bench both fought to have control over the prosecution of witnesses, especially key political witnesses. And not only does this reflect the partisan nature of those two forums, but it also demonstrates the struggle over what information should be public and what information should be kept private. And so the House of Commons was really trying to bring to light a lot of what they perceived as misconduct by the king and the court and his advisors. So there's this struggle over what the king wanted to keep kind of closer to his chest versus what House of Commons wanted to be kept about. And there's this really fantastic quote by a contemporary of the time, the Earl of Anglesey, who articulated during this period that the Civil War had now transformed itself into a judicial war, fought in judicial battles.
That's fascinating. Just turning maybe to the populist angle a little bit, you mentioned in the paper and the talk that these conspiracies had a way of empowering the disempowered. Can you just elaborate on that? How, like, what did the people in the non-ruling classes gain politically, psychodynamically, socially from conspiracy? What does it do for them?
Yeah, because a lot of this conspiratorial belief really derived from distrust in authorities and suspicion over corruption and deception by those who were in charge. Conspiratorial thought provided the opportunity from people who were from the Protestant mainstream who were normally engaged in political discourse to enter that form of discussion. And there's also in this period, there's an act that lapses, which was essentially a copyright act that's called the Licensing Act, and it enabled widespread censorship, and it lapses during this period. So as a result, there's this proliferation of printing and partisan perspectives from all sides. And because of the dominance of anti-Catholic prejudices, it was became kind of if this becomes an effective tool in this this influx of printing in order to attack political rivals as well. So it kind of, this universal language of anti-Catholicism kind of provided the voice in order to express political concerns from people who weren't normally involved in that conversation.
That's fascinating. Maybe we just turn to the Catholics for a moment. So how would you say this event affected the Catholic population, so the general Catholic population? And maybe, do we have a sense of how big that population was?
I think it's estimated to be around 2% in this period. So it's quite a small population, but the majority of people, of English Catholics, were of higher social status, so appeared more dominant than they actually were. So the effect on the English Catholic community was immediate and pervasive. And not only did you have innocent English Catholics being arrested and prosecuted on treason charges, but you also had the strict enforcement of general anti-Catholic laws. So typically, the English legal system experienced a gap between the word of the law and the actual practice of the law, application of the law, and this gap really narrows as these fears are expressed. There's an increase in the number of Catholic priests who are arrested for being Catholic priests. One historian estimates that there was around 42 priests who were arrested during this period. And then in 1678, there's a Test Act passed, which essentially further strengthened the law against Catholics holding public offices. So there's a crackdown on Catholics in public offices, and in the House of Lords. And there was also in 1678, it was ordered that all suspected Catholics be identified, which seems insane. But this put them at risk for being prosecuted for recusancy, which was basically not attending Anglican services. Yeah.
No, that's really amazing. Okay, let's quickly do the political party issue, because this is kind of really interesting. So can you just elaborate a little bit about how political parties arose out of the wake of this? And I guess the more general question that arises out of that is, what does it say about party politics in the Anglo-American world that they seem to have arisen out of a post-Reformation conflict? Like, is there any general lesson to be learned here about that wider sweep? So let's do a two-part question. What's the local conditions that could rise to the party politics? And then this impossibly difficult question, what's the broader consequence of that?
Yes, so the Popish Plot crisis is generally seen as the foundation of this rise in party politics, which is kind of formalized during the exclusion crisis. So during this political crisis that follows the Popish Plot. And the fact that people during this period were identifying themselves with political factions that were in opposition with each other was very radical compared to earlier periods, which understood factionalism as undesirable and potentially destructive to governments. So what we can see in this period is political needs of the moment really outweighing this previous concern. And so party politics are thus born out of pressing political and religious tensions and issues that require seemingly really urgent attention. And so this crisis really reveals a divide across the social hierarchy surrounding political issues, which appeared to necessitate this change of governance. Yeah.
And do those political factions become identity categories for people? Like, do they become like, I am, this, and somehow it becomes linked to religion or to a social identity way? Or does it remain really more a matter of different policy?
I think it becomes more of a matter of policy, especially when you move into the 18th century. These political divisions really become strengthened. And they become expressed not just in Parliament, but in publications as well. But yeah.
Okay. Maybe if I have one more, I'll just give you the opportunity to think about the presentist question of, okay, so how does this relate then to some of the contemporary concerns that we're dealing with, whichever one you think is most relevant? I'm sure others will have great questions, but just to initiate that, sort of apply it to our moment.
Yeah, I think, well, what it really reveals is that conspiratorial politics and thought are responding to real and legitimate concerns. So I think in a lot of conspiratorial beliefs that we can see today, there's a grain of truth or a valid concern that is rooted in a lot of those beliefs, and kind of also demonstrates how quickly these things can escalate into judicial and political consequences. And I think you can also really identify with the way in which conspiratorial beliefs, like in the 17th century, really permeate our society, and especially the political sphere. In both periods, conspiratorial thought can be interpreted in different ways. Whereas we see today, and also in the 17th century, where there's some groups and individuals who really ardently subscribe to this conspiratorial beliefs and genuinely think that things like people agendas and international cabals really do exist. But probably much larger group of people are aware of these bubbling anxieties and insecurities, which people more willing to believe alternative truth narratives, even if only to some extent. And then there's a group of people who exploit these fears for their own advantage, right?
All right.
But yeah, I think it really speaks to it being striking both in our modern day and in the 17th century, kind of this widespread sentiment of distrust, which makes people open to believing that they're being kept in the dark and that there are secrets of wrongful conduct kind of lying beneath the surface.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll open up to a broader conversation now, right? To the supervisor, starting us off.
Well, I thought that was excellent presentation, but and no conjunction, just a random conjunction, but not a but. And when Sarah was talking about just giving some of the background, and I think you're absolutely right to say that the historiography really focused initially on this being hysterical, but also the idea of Shaftesbury, the Earl of Shaftesbury as the puppet master. And that was one of the central themes, that he's the father of the Whigs. He's a little sanitized by people who don't want to talk about the Popish Plot, so they focus on exclusion. But what's really teleological about that story, and oversimplistic, because it wasn't just Shaftesbury, etc., is the fact that initially everyone thought that the plot was the plot of the government, because it was the king's principal minister, the Earl of Danby, who fostered it, who brought it, who thought he could use it. And so your point about suspicions that Charles was trying to get a standing army, it's exactly what his minister was trying to do. His minister thought he could use the plot, and he was pretty explicit about it, to make a plot to get so that Parliament would give money and allow him to do this. And he, in fact, fed the main witness, Titus Oates, some of the information that was compelling. So I guess I'm saying this because partly it helps understand the conservative judges who are left with this problem where there's an obvious cover-up, and they, like everyone else, legitimately want to get to the bottom of it. And it sort of reminds me of the Epstein files, where it's what the brother of one of those judges, Roger North, says, the bottomless pit, because you're always trying to get to the bottom, but you never get to the bottom. And so it was. This is just a cautionary tale for these days, is that you can't help but think maybe there is something in the Epstein files. Maybe if we just knew more. So yeah, I think that I'm not sure that just to give a little bit more context there, just that there was not only good reason to suspect the government, but the government had initially tried to weaponize it itself. So rather than just Shaftesbury being the puppet master.
Nice. Yeah, Francis.
Yeah, me.
Yeah, you.
I was wondering about was there any role of literature, of poetry and plays in particular, in furthering the plot. I was thinking of Dryden. I remember Dryden.
Yeah, exactly.
Dryden became more and more explicitly Catholic.
Yeah,
I can't remember his poem, The Hanged or something like that.
he writes a play that is explicitly about the plot and includes kind of representations of some of these political figures that Andrea was just discussing. Yeah.
And what role did these plays and these poems play in furthering or dismissing the plot fantasy?
I'm not sure to what extent it furthered belief in fantasy in beliefs, but I think it definitely speaks to the fact that the plot had immersed itself into popular culture, especially as we in some of these playing cards that I've shown here, the fact that it entered into literature. This first slide I had, it's got some of these cards were then printed onto tiles and used potentially for decoration. So it's really just entering, like becoming almost a commodity, and really entering that popular culture.
Yeah, Keelan.
You think I can get any to redo my backsplash? That's not my actual question. Yeah, I did probably would. Hey, thanks, Sarah. This has been amazing. It's been so enlightening. Thanks for that. So, if my read of like the English genocide of the Irish is like at all accurate, and religion was kind of more of an excuse to clear land, colonize land. Would it be fair to ask you what the downstream consequences would be to other populations living in the UK at the time, who like Jewish populations who don't necessarily have much Pope interaction, but like there might be an adjacency issue there, particularly if we're talking about conspiratoriality, cabals, let alone Irish populations or other Catholic populations that might have been in the UK. Like any sense of how that at a grassroots level might have played out? Yeah, I mean the Irish Catholic population really bore a lot of the brunt of this prosecution. Ormond at the end of the plot is the last person to be executed, and he's an Irish, of Irish gentry. But yeah, it's because there was not only this level of suspicion of Catholics, but this additional suspicion of Irish Catholics, right? It's kind of disproportionate numbers of people who were accused and suspected of being involved in these sort of Catholic conspiracies were Irish. Do we see any street justice? Like, any sense that there's any kind of roaming gangs of Protestants going through London, dragging Irish out of their houses, or Catholics for that matter? I'm not sure if I can speak exactly to whether there were gangs or not, but there was definitely this sense that was really ingrained in this entire crisis, that you couldn't speak against the plot, you couldn't speak against the witnesses, you couldn't express that you didn't believe the testimony without facing risk of being accused yourself, right? So there's instances, and there's a couple people who are either arrested or who are later turned plot witnesses who are overheard speaking poorly of people or speaking against the plot, and then become suspect themselves. There's an instance of one English Catholic pretty early on in the crisis he's not anyone of any political importance, but he's executed because he's overheard Staley. Yeah, Staley. He's overheard expressing discontent. Yeah. Thanks very much. That's awesome.
Right, Justin.
Sarah, wonderful. Your talk is so enriched by the visual materials and the print culture of the time, and so I wonder. Gary talked about it falling in this post-Reformation era, and I often think about the Reformation, of course, as the emergence of Catholic versus Protestant, but it's also the time of print, the birth of print culture. So can you talk about just print technology or this emergence of political parties? How do you think the visual and the printing kind of supported that? Did one side have more access to printing and visual culture than the other?
Well, I think that's a really interesting element of this is a lot of these images that we see here are featured alongside poems or other forms of text, which really express different partisan perspectives. For example, this one here on the bottom right, the Committee of Popery Masquerade,
This is a pamphleteer who is very sympathetic to the Tory perspective. And so below this image would have been a poem that was expressing the sentiments of this. And this kind of shows a group of Protestants of different denominations all coming together in what's supposed to be a critique of the Civil War. So I think it really speaks to the fact that it was still a moment in which there was varying levels of literacy. And so what would be common is that some of these pamphlets would have been available in coffee houses or places like that, or would be read aloud, or that these images kind of provide alternative ways for people to understand the crisis without having to read them.
And were there more Protestant pamphlets than Catholic, or?
I think probably due to the fact that the Protestant population so outweighed that of Catholics. There's definitely a certain amount of literature that came out during the period that was published by Catholics. There's a Catholic midwife called Elizabeth Cellier, who later ends up being prosecuted, but she releases this piece of literature during the crisis that's very much expressing the innocence of Catholics and also accusing people involved in prosecuting the plot of torturing plot witnesses as well. So,
Brian.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. This is marvelous. My question is about the role, both politically and socially, of apprentices, which is such a unique group, especially in London. Do you want to just talk about apprentices and their role in all of this?
This is something that I've been starting to dive more into recently, because they do play such an important role, especially in terms of these sorts of acts of political participation that so it's something that I'm just starting to get into, but yeah, I would. Yeah. Did you read Tim Harris's London Crowds?
Yeah, that's.
Great. So Paul.
Thank you very much for that. That was lovely. Couple questions. I mean, I wonder if you could help situate what you presented today within the larger thesis project. You know, do you see the project as mainly descriptive, or what kind of question are you tracing throughout the whole thing, and how does this play a part in that? Another thing I love to hear from grad students, especially MA students, is, you know, take us back to that moment where you thought to yourself, you know what I should do? I should totally do this. You know, like where did this, I mean, obviously you have such a sophisticated grasp of the literature and of the period, which is so lovely to see, so impressive. I'd love to come back to the moment where you thought, oh, this.
Yeah, I think I'd had a fair amount of exposure to this period leading up to it, and I knew I wanted to study something to do with Restoration period, to do with religious dynamics and religious tensions. And the Popish Plot is just, it looms very large in the period, and it's such a complex one with so many complex crises, with so many different elements and so many people interpreting things. I think that's what really drew it to me. I mean, the obvious thing is also our modern culture is becoming increasingly conspiratorial. So that really had a modern element that was appealing, and it really feels like it's become even more relevant to my project as the year and a half since I started it has progressed. The political climate has become increasingly unsure. But yeah, so with my project, I'm really looking to narrow in, especially on the judicial bench. And so I'm really going to look primarily at this Lord Chief Justice and look at the way that Parliament responded to him during the crisis, and the ways that he, and as well as some of the other judges, responded to critique and attack of them, and as well as their growing concern over this growing political participation by the public.
Thank you. I did the first comment and then my question. The comment is just building on what you just said. To indulge in presentism, there's hope in your presentation, in the sense that the country didn't disintegrate,
Yeah.
right? They got over it, and as we sort of deal with the daily news coming off of Twitter, you know, the current iteration of broadsides, let's say, there still may be hope. My question builds on Jessica's point, and that is through information networks, and I can't get over the fact that this is the birth of party politics. And I wonder if this signals a type of information failure of mass culture where individuals can no longer individually engage with the information that's being fed to them through the information networks. And if we think of the metaphors of printing presses, you know, stereotype, the word cliche is onomatopoeia for the sound the printing press makes, right? It's just this repeated thing that goes out, and the party is also that type of stereotyped printed thing. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you can say to that. I'm just fascinated by this.
Yeah, I think to speak to your first point, I think the climate is completely unprecedented and terrifying in a way that is really valid to be concerned about. But it's also definitely that this time period seemed completely unprecedented to people who were living then too. And these crises seem to be completely unprecedented. So maybe a glimmer of some reassurance, but and now I've just forgotten the second part of your.
Oh, just this creation of the party system and this sort of stereotype that I can no longer, information is too complex for me to come up with my own opinion, and the party provides the checklist for me, right?
Yeah, and I think that was something that it really appears that these two opposing political groups were really hoping to exploit and really feed on, was this trying to sway public opinion in different ways by really pushing the printing of literature that really was reflective of their own political agendas, and really also crucially attacked their political rivals. Yeah.
Right, Martin, last quick question.
Okay, I just wondered when you talk about public opinion and, you know, we think of who the public was composed of, to what degree a class analysis might come into this disambiguating between the middle class and, say, you know, I'm not sure if the jury's rag and tag were like illiterate people, and you've also talked a lot about literacy. So what was going on in terms of the poor at this time, and did they have a different role in this whole set of equations coming into this conspiracy, or, you know, and there was all kinds of, you know, movements amongst the poor for their own religious Protestant forms. So I'm just wondering if the class can come into it, maybe we can more distinguish amongst different groups in the public.
Yeah, like this political participation still wasn't very public and common in the way that we would think today. Like political participation really was still exclusive to certain elite groups. House of Commons was made up of mostly elite men. And so then when I'm speaking about this political participation by the public, this is still really talking about high middle class people, right? Like it's still not extending in this period to people of middle social status or lower social status as yet. But this is still radical compared to what it had been like before, right? So the fact that people like merchants and bankers are becoming involved municipal, not just on the municipal level, but in terms of state level, through petitions and pamphleteering and rioting procession, the Pope burning processions as well. It was completely radical to how it had been for so long.
So they are literate, for the most part, and the rag and tag were on the juries.
Yeah, so what you see is this expression by people of very elite status, correlating people of less elite status who are still quite elite as being the tag in the rag. Yeah.
Upper middle class.
Okay, upper middle class rag and tag.
But the rag is the material that the broadsides are made of, right? The copper rag. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah. Join us next week, same time, same place, for Jessica Fishner-Nolan, who will be talking about unsilencing voices of religious trauma. So join us for that next week. Thanks, everyone.